Good afternoon. It's great to see all of you here today, and I want to welcome you to the now 7th Leadership Research Colloquium that we've held here at FIU at the FIU Center for Leadership. So if any of you are so inclined to tweet, feel free to share your tweets using the hashtag FIULead for today's event. My name is Nathan Hiller, and I'm the Academic Director at the Center for Leadership. And I just want to tell you very briefly about this research colloquium. We started this 7 years ago. It was started really as an idea, thinking how do we bring together conversations from academics who are doing research and often working with leaders. How do we start to bring these conversations and bridge some of the academic work that they're doing and share that with the FIU community? And we're so thrilled that we've had such a great turnout for each of the years, but also from the diversity of people who are here. So we have students here. We have people who've driven from miles away who come onto campus. And for some of you, this may be your first time even on campus. We have faculty, we have staff, we have graduate students. And we're just thrilled to bring everyone together and share with you a little bit about some of the cutting edge research that's happening in the area of leadership. So today the center is, we are thrilled to welcome 3 distinguished speakers. One who's come from particularly far away, about 100 yards, our very own Brooke Buckman from FIU. To my immediate right is Dr. Jeff Lovelace, and on the other side of Brooke is Dr. Dorothy Carter. So we have all 3 of them here. We'll be each sharing a bit about some of their research that's been happening in their world, on the teams that they are on, and some of the research that they're leading. All of these talks today are centered sort of broadly around the idea of how individuals influence teams and groups, and that takes a very different tack depending on each kind of talk. So our first speaker today is Dr. Jeff Lovelace. His research examines the social and cognitive influences that shape leader behavior, that shape leader-follower relationships, and performance at the individual as well as at the firm level. He's currently working on several projects that examine the sense-making processes of leaders and how variables like CEO celebrity, so some CEOs become almost celebrities. What does that do to them? How does that affect the way that they run their organizations? Because it turns out has a pretty big impact. And how status and reputation of senior executives influence their behaviors as senior executives. Professor Lovelace has taught leadership and psychology classes at the undergraduate and graduate level. He has also run a number of corporate education workshops for a variety of organizations in both the public and private sector. Prior to his academic career, he served as an officer in the U.S. Army for 12 years, from 2002 to 2014. Most recently, he was assistant professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point, otherwise known as West Point. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lovelace.
Thank you for that introduction, Nathan, and thank you all very much for the invitation to come here. I'm excited to be with you today and to share a little bit about the research that I'm currently working on. I've been blown away by the opportunity to be here and just how beautiful the campus is and truly impressive, so thank you very much for this opportunity. The talk that I'm going to do with you today is about the myth of the yellow brick road, is what I call it. Really the many avenues that we can utilize to examine what does it mean to be an effective leader. Okay, and what I mean by that is when you look at people like this, what do they all have in common? All highly effective in their respective fields, but I would argue to you that they haven't gotten there the same way. And the way that they went about their leadership styles varied, how they were able to connect with their followers was different, and yet they were all able to really achieve the pinnacle in their respective fields. And so I think that conflicts a little bit with the ideas that we often see on leadership. And so the question that kind of guides my talk today is there really one effective way to be a leader? When we look at popular press sorts of articles, you kind of get the 5 ways you're supposed to do this. How do you become a leader that's going to be remarkably effective, right? This is how you have to lead in 2018. These are the characteristics that you're trying to demonstrate. And if you want to be great, you've got to be patient. Okay, well, why and how? What's the process? What are these things affecting? I think we can get into the nuance of these sorts of questions in greater detail, and we've been set up to do this well. I think we're at a very unique time in our research efforts and what we're doing in the applied sectors to be able to understand this a little bit better. At least that's the perspective that I come at with this. And that's not to say that these aren't helpful. I read these articles. They're helpful to development. I think they allow us to reflect on leadership, help us to think about things in a different way. But I'm going to encourage us to continue that process of thinking about things a little bit differently when it comes to leadership. So this is not just a phenomenon that occurs in more popular sorts of press articles about leadership. We actually see this in our own research areas, that we're overly committed to charismatic, transformational perspectives on leadership, which are very important. And don't get me wrong, we've learned a lot about leadership by investigating this area, by the phenomenon from a transformational, charismatic perspective. But we do know that there's some sustained critiques of these areas. There's some psychometric issues for the measurement sorts of ways that we look at these issues. When we look at causality, if a leader does X, and what does that result in? Those relationships aren't always as clear as I think they should be, or, we don't find the results as consistently as we would like to see them. And so why might that be the case? I think that what we see is there might be some additional complexities to how we might view leadership, how we might investigate it as a phenomenon moving forward to shed better light, not only from our research set, but what we're recommending to people out in the applied sector. One of the things I like to refer to when I think about this perspective is really what's the big picture. We live in a world today that's much more complex than it has been in recent history. The demographics of the workplace are only getting more diverse. Technology and globalization are happening at faster and faster rates, and so maybe a one-size-fits-all mentality is not necessarily the perspective that we need to have. And I think we're starting to see this in trends on leadership and what we're looking at. We're starting to see things like shared leadership or leadership within teams that are interesting ways of approaching what that might look like. Not just the leader that we put on the pedestal as the one person we romanticize on what their impact may be within the organization. Right? We're seeing a larger commitment to what's the process of leadership over time. So not single interactions with leaders, though oftentimes we'll investigate them that way, and I'm doing that in some of the things I'm going to talk to you about in an exploratory way today. And additionally, what's the importance of the follower? We don't look at leadership as just this one individual anymore. It's about a relationship between the leader, the follower, and the environment that they operate in. We really need to consider all of those things, including things like what's the level that they're at in the organization, from lower level to upper echelons of the organizations, as well as what's the crisis that might be going on. These are all factors that we have to really weigh into our thought process on leadership. So the leadership lens that I take really comes from what my background is. And Nathan mentioned my military experience. About 9 years into my military experience, a year removed from being in combat in Iraq, I come into academia and begin to be exposed in a more in-depth way to how we think about things from a conceptual standpoint in the research. And it made a lot of sense to me, but at the same time, I had leaders that had lifelong impacts on me that I didn't see necessarily fitting into some of these models of leadership. And it left me with questions on how we might better understand alternatives to being successful. And that was when I was exposed to the CIP model, the charismatic, ideological, and pragmatic model of leadership. This comes from Mike Mumford out of Oklahoma and his colleagues that have worked on this approach to leadership. And essentially what it tells us is there are different ways that leaders can go about being highly effective. But you have to understand how they go about doing those things. And I'll describe those to you here in just a moment. That these leaders take these different tasks and have different sorts of impacts on their followers, which ultimately results in overall performance on the aggregate being equal. So whether you're a charismatic leader or a pragmatic leader, you take a different path to get to the same endpoint, right? And one of the things that really appealed to me about this perspective and approaching things in this way was that it really took into account leaders, followers, and context, and didn't put all the weight or all the understanding of the phenomenon simply on the leader. They were just simply the viewpoint, the lens from which we viewed how all these things come together. And so when you think about the CIP model of leadership, this really comes from how leaders form their prescriptive mental models. And what I mean by that is descriptive is sort of what's going on behind the scenes and how do I make sense of what's happening. Prescriptive is cognitively how you start to craft your plan for how you're going to address the situation. And everything kind of stems from that point. And you have charismatic leaders who are vision-based. They usually have very future-oriented, very hopeful visions of the future, tied to positive uses of affect and experience to frame those sorts of things. And their appeals tend to be more mass, not as much detail, more broad to pull the whole group in. You have the ideological leaders, these vision-based leaders, and I had to throw kind of a Penn State reference in here. You may not know, but Ben and Jerry did graduate from the Penn State ice cream program, so we like to claim them. If you ever go to Penn State, check it out. So they take a more values-based perspective on leadership and how they approach things. What's the beliefs and values that dictate how we're going to do this? And our vision of the future is very tied to adherence to those sorts of traditions. They have a balance of affect. They intend to will invoke fear if it means we break from our values and traditions. And it's a way that they kind of get people in line with what they believe. But you can see how that might appeal to people that believe the same things that they do. And then you have the pragmatic leaders, the Warren Buffetts of the world, that are very logic-based, right? They look at the problem in front of them and, like a surgeon, begin to diagnose that. And they use logical appeals, rational persuasion to get people that have the expertise, the knowledge, skills, and ability in line with their perspective to help them deal with the issue. So not as broad-based, more focused on the now and the issues that you're dealing with. Okay? So to give you kind of that baseline understanding of those, one of the other things that I said appealed to me about this is it really weighs in and it values the importance of what's going on with followers, what's going on with context, not just what the leader is thinking. And we're seeing that in some of the CIP research that this is actually the case. And so in specific sorts of contexts, like in the study done by Bedell Alvarez et al., they looked at leader performance on problem-solving tasks and rated it on quality and originality of their responses to these problems. And they found that while overall in the aggregate they did not differ, when you looked at these specific metrics, they found differences in which leaders were more successful if you were rating them on quality or originality. Jen Griffith and company did another study where they looked at the affective use, or how they used affective appeals. And they found differences in how followers perceived leaders, not on their overall performance, which was on aggregate the same, but in terms of things like their perceptions of a leader's authenticity. Where pragmatic leaders, the more rationally based leaders, not evoking those emotions from their followers, actually were seen to be more authentic than their counterparts. And this set me up to really get into one of my first forays into this area, which was my thesis, where we looked at how do leaders of different styles influence follower creative performance across the creative process. So what I mean by that is when you break down how a problem is solved, there tends to be an early stage where you are looking at what is the issue and you have to accurately define what the problem is. When you look in the middle stage, it's more about what are the ideas that we need to generate to deal with the issue, and then ultimately how do you implement what those ideas would be. And so we created in a laboratory study Confederates that acted as the leaders and portrayed leadership styles, and then we looked at how follower outcomes rated by other coders, in which we had all the inter-rater agreement on their performance, how that differentially impacted that follower performance. And this paper is published, I'm not going to go through all the details, but there's two things that I thought were really interesting about the findings that we had from this study. And the first one was, on a short duration task, we were able to see that on the rating of, on outcomes of originality, charismatic leaders, as you see right here, had a huge impact on their followers' performance in terms of their originality on the output to the solution that they were trying to come up with. And so we can see that that was a huge impact on a specific task along the process. And this, we did see some overall ratings where ideological and charismatic leaders are actually rated more highly than the pragmatic leaders, and I'll talk about that here again in a minute, which is not what we had expected from the theory. The other thing that I thought was really interesting about this is we invoked a stress condition. And we had a high stress, low stress condition where they actually had the same amount of time to complete the task, but we gave them a perception that their time was more limited. And what we found was that the followers in situations that had charismatic ideological leaders in the low stress position outperformed pragmatic, but in the high stress condition actually were affected by that and had a decline in their performance. So the pragmatics maintained those in the pragmatic condition maintained their performance level and didn't see those same performance declines. Now again, that was on a lower level. Part of the reason we think that's the case is think about those pragmatic leaders, rationally based leaders, using logical appeals, a very quick duration sort of interaction with the follower. That's not a lot of time to engender a sense of competence in what you're able to do, right? And that's how they operate. So if you know you're a more pragmatic leader, perhaps you need to really be committed to the time that you're going to spend to demonstrate your competence before people really begin to trust you the same way that they might a charismatic or ideological leader who quickly hit at those emotions, right? So this led on to the next part of my efforts here, and this is very exploratory. We're dealing with this right now. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about how we differentiate these outcomes. And so we started looking at what are some other types of outcomes where we might say that these leaders inspire different levels of performance if we look at specific sorts of tasks that they're working on. And so what we did is we got a sample of leaders from MTurk. We screened them to have at least a year of leadership experience. And then we recruited followers from a student sample, making sure that they at least had 1 year of work experience outside of doing something at the university. For this, what we did was the leaders were exposed to a problem-solving task. They were asked to solve a high-crisis situation and discuss what their plan would be. And then we randomly assigned the followers into those leaders' conditions where they read the plan by the leader and then responded to questions about their perceptions of their relationship competence. So how well do they deal with people, their task competence, how competent are they going to be in solving this issue, as well as their willingness to follow those individuals. And what we realized was when we looked at the variance that was occurring in these situations, there was things going on at the individual level, so stuff about the individual mattered, but also things about the leader mattered to how they were rating their performance. And originally that was not our thought. We were not thinking there's going to be a lot going on at the individual level, it's all going to be about the style. But it's starting to show us this multi-level phenomenon, that at the individual level, something about them matters just as much about what the leader's style matters. We have to understand that a little bit better. What we did with the data that we did have was we made a couple of predictions about it. One, we thought that individuals that had a high focus on the future, charismatic sort of focus, are going to be more positively related to perceptions of relationship competence. So if you have a heavy dose of charismatic leadership and the plan that you have, you're going to see the benefit when it comes to relationship competence. If you had a heavy dose of pragmatic leadership orientation, so you take that more problem-focused approach, you're actually going to see more benefit when it comes to the task competence perceptions. And then the last piece here, because it was a more broad rating of performance, just the willingness to follow, we thought any of the leadership styles should be equally able to predict leading towards that. And to be clear, we measured each individual's response to the problem on all 3 of these leadership styles, because I didn't think we should put them into one box. I wanted to see if there would be interaction between them having high levels of the charismatic orientation and mixing that with high levels of the pragmatic orientation. Though we tested it at first to see if our primary predictions came through. So basically what we found when we tested this first relationship between the charismatic orientation and the relationship competence, we did see the relationship that we expected. We saw that positive relationship between your charismatic focus leading to higher levels of relationship competence. So that positive view of the future is benefiting you in terms of how people are seeing your ability to relate to others. We then looked at the direct connection to willingness to follow. And we saw also there was a positive relationship there. And I should mention that all this was done utilizing multi-level structural equation modeling. So not to get too statsy into the discussion, but we used the appropriate method based on where we were seeing things happen at the individual level as well as at the leader level. This came to a point where we wanted to be a little bit more exploratory. And so what we saw was that when we accounted for the connection between relationship competence and willingness to follow, that direct connection here between charismatic and willingness to follow disappeared. So meaning this, initial indication is these charismatic leaders get people to be willing to follow them based upon this personal piece of connection, which makes sense, right? But I think we're starting to see these pathways and get a better understanding of what they're actually doing. We did the same process with the pragmatic condition, and we found that the same thing occurred. Pragmatics were positively related to task competence perceptions. When we accounted for the mediation taking place, the indirect connection, that direct piece from pragmatic orientation to willingness to follow disappeared and actually appears to be operating through perceptions of task competence. We saw several interactions taking place that were statistically significant. So if you had high levels of pragmatic orientation, high levels of ideological orientation, it mattered, but it was difficult to dissect those. And I'll talk about how we handle that moving forward and what we're looking to do in future studies. All right? So just in terms of this sort of follow-up, after we did this, there actually is information coming up that some of these internal follower things matter. Thurgood and Sawyer saw that followers have a preference for certain leadership styles. And Griffith et al. In 2018 found that those mental models we mentioned, they matter. Because if a follower's mental model matches the leader, they actually have bumps in their performance. And so that might be some of that internal stuff that's going on. We've made some recommendations on where we go moving forward. One is to extend our look at leaders that go beyond the upper echelon level. Because that's really where this type of effort has primarily focused. That we want to look at leaders that are in active organizations. Because it's either been lab studies if it hasn't looked at high-level organizational leaders, and that our methods need to expand. So we need to get good scales in place because we need to do those very quickly if we want to actually study people in the workplace. They're not going to let us do a huge, long study and get a lot of people in if we don't have the right methods to be able to investigate those questions. So one of the things we're really recommending is maybe we don't look at this the way that it has been presented in the past, either one of these things, but instead we might see what we have are these mixed model types of leaders, where certain leaders demonstrate characteristics that move across these leadership styles. And that raises questions like, if you do have a mixed profile, what are you good at doing to adapt to your followers? What else do you need to have? Is it your social intelligence that allows you to really enhance your performance? Which I think is a break a little bit from how leadership is looked at in the research. And if we answer these questions, I think we can have some big impact for recommendations in the applied sector. One of the things moving forward and how we're trying to handle this, not to get really all too statsy on this here, but instead of approaching this with traditional techniques, one of the things that we're doing is we have developed a scale. I did not talk about that today. We can psychometrically geek out on that with anybody that wants to talk about it offline. But we've developed a scale, and we've started to use that to measure. And what we're doing is look, how do people vary and cluster in groups in terms of the profiles that they might present? And I just look at this as initial evidence that maybe we're onto something here. You can see we have some leaders that are very mixed in the way that they present themselves, like these two here. But this red bar here, you see a very ideological perspective in the grouping, okay? And so people vary in these things, and I think we're onto something to maybe ask questions in these sorts of ways. Not how highly do you rate on the transformational scale, for example, but how does the pattern of your responses predict the sorts of outcomes that we might be interested in? So just a bit of a leaning forward where we're trying to go with this. So future directions here, we're looking at this and using this approach to look at profile emergence. We're looking at West Point cadets and how is their leadership profile evolving over their time at West Point. We're looking at shared leadership scenarios and how it might impair people. So for example, on that thesis discussion I told you, is it better to have a pragmatic leader do the first stage and then bring in a charismatic leader to maximize people's performance, or maybe just to train you to exhibit those sorts of behaviors? Those are the types of questions that we want to ask. We're also looking at some of these perceptions by gender, and how does it matter if you're a male or female leader in terms of how other people are seeing you? Does that hold the same way across profiles? And last, really, what's that fit? So we've seen some groundwork for that fit between leader and followers matter. Now if we adopt the perspective that we're advocating for, can we get more nuance? Maybe even if you're a pragmatic follower, a mixed leader would still work for you because you can pick up those characteristics that you need. So maybe you have a broader appeal than somebody that has profile really focused on one of these different leadership styles. So these are some of the questions that we're trying to get into in the research that we're doing. So just the summary takeaways that I would have for everybody is I really think that we're at an opportune time to ask some of these more complex questions. We've learned a lot, but I'm trying to challenge myself to go use different methods and different approaches to look at leadership and try to look at what are the insights that we're gleaning from our research. I think there's evidence supporting us to look at these more complex methods, and that there are additionally multiple pathways that leaders might take to be highly successful. And not to forget that we have to look at these in terms of not only the leader, but the follower and the context. They're just as important to the questions we ask. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you all for your time. I'll be happy to answer any of your questions a little bit later on.
So you can probably imagine that we're having we're hosting this colloquium here about leadership and what we know about leadership research, and I just want to emphasize briefly this phenomenon that I think is so fascinating, is that leadership is an art and a science, but we're actually understanding some pieces about the science that we did 10, 20, 30 years ago, and it's really helping us understand how the complexities of this phenomena occur, and it often looks a little bit different than we might think. And so some of the common sense wisdom, it turns out to be that it leads us in the wrong path. And so the next time you see the 4 things you must do if you want to be an effective leader, the 6 traits, we talk about this all the time at the center, and I think Jeff's work also is in line with this. What if you don't have the formula to be an effective leader? And the great news is there is no formula, right? Is that if you are a charismatic leader, you're going to be good at some things and you're not going to be good at other things. And so it's understanding what you're going to have more trouble with and figuring out the workarounds, right? So is it better? And to me this is also exciting because for many of us, we're not the charismatic people who feel like we're trying to, we can channel Martin Luther King Jr. Like, for many of us, we think, I could never be that charismatic. But the good news is that leadership takes on many forms and looks differently. And so many people, thank you for that reminder, right? That it can look different. And so it can look, and you can still be highly effective. So thank you, Jeff. And we'll have some time, again, for questions at the end. We'll do it all at once. I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Brooke Buckman, who is one of our very own here at FIU. She joined us in 2014, right, having finished her PhD from Arizona State University. She did her undergraduate degree at Notre Dame and then spent some time at a school in Gainesville. I can't remember the name. I don't know. And before graduate school, spent some time as an accountant. And I think this is something that's really interesting, that all three of our presenters today have had lives in various forms. Brooke was an accountant. Dorothy was a professional ballet dancer. Not exactly what you think of when you think of a typical professor, right? And Jeff, of course, spent some time in the military. So Dr. Buckman examines, has a broad research program. Her published research has examined the various ways that leaders enhance their followers' level of engagement, as well as how different types of leader behaviors influence their followers' perceptions of fairness in the face of stressful job demands. She has published a review of the research regarding how the personalities within a team influence teamwork and team effectiveness, and a book chapter that describes the various implications, both good and bad, of having strong, positive relationships among team members, right? So what are the good and bad? And she's will be presenting us, talking a little bit about some of her work on authenticity. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Brooke Buckman.
Good afternoon. Let's see. All right.
You can move around if you want to. It's up to you. You don't have to be stuck.
See, I feel pretty authentic standing right here. I'll be good. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hiller, for that introduction. The topic of my talk is all authenticity is not created equal. Examining its influence on personal, relational, and career outcomes. And I appreciate the introduction because my interest in this topic began when I graduated from college. I wasn't just an accountant, I was an auditor at KPMG. And I really struggled initially in that role. It didn't feel authentic to me. Now just imagine, as a 22-year-old woman walking into Fortune 500, controllers, and other high-level accounting positions in organizations, and my job was 1, to find other people's mistakes, and 2, to tell them they had made mistakes. And it drained me as an individual because I didn't see necessarily the value in the role. I didn't feel like I was getting meaning or making a good, positive difference. And I also was just extremely intimidated. So I struggled. And one of my coworkers really took me under her wing. And she tried really hard to keep me motivated and inspired. And one thing she did was she would slip little inspirational quotes, either through email or on my chair, and they looked something like this: "Be you, and the world will adjust." Right? "Don't change so people will like you. Be yourself, and the right people will love the real you." And that was insightful to me in that role because I felt so inauthentic. I felt like I was faking a role, and I felt like I wasn't even doing it well. And so she kept encouraging me to come up with ways of doing that role in a way that felt more authentic and more real. So instead of walking into offices of intimidating individuals and telling them they did something wrong, I decided to come up with a way where I just acted confused, right? So I was bringing it to them and allowing them to discover that they had made a mistake. So by crafting my role and changing it to some degree, I felt more authentic. I felt like I fit better, like it was working better for me. But in the context of doing that, I encountered all kinds of people, right? When you're going into people's offices, you encounter the person that's always negative, the grumpy one, the one that tells you he never has time to answer your questions, or throws you out and slams the door, or the woman that you can tell doesn't feel very confident in her role, or maybe she over-discloses problems going on at home, and you're kind of sitting there being like, why is she telling me this stuff, right? And so even though these messages worked well for me and helped motivate me and got me to a place where I was more comfortable in my role, I started to wonder if this idea of encouraging everyone to be authentic wasn't necessarily the right advice for everyone. So in other words, is be yourself the worst advice you could give some people? We can all think of someone in our lives. We're like, yeah, we don't actually think they should be themselves. We're sure. And so that's where the seed planted, that we actually see examples of this in an increasingly frequent manner. Just this week, this was a headline in the Guardian newspaper. So a French waiter says firing for rudeness is discrimination against my culture. He was being himself. Sorry if the customers think I'm a little rude. That's just who I am. I'm French. Right? Another example, there's actually a website called Jerks at Work. Let me get this. I can honestly admit that I'm a yeller at work. I know my colleagues don't mind. After I blow up, I always apologize. It's just how I operate. Recently, my manager came down on me about my outbursts. It didn't seem to matter to him that others understand this is just who I am. How can I get him to stop worrying about this? It's just who I am, right? And even as an authenticity scholar, I might be a hammer that's looking for nails, but 2 recent high-profile issues extend this issue of authenticity being taken to an extreme, to the point where it ends up being costly to organizations. The first one, you see the example of Uber. And we see on the bottom are 2 values that were explicit cultural values of Uber under the now ex-CEO, Travis Kalanick. The first one is be authentic, and no one can argue that he was not an authentic CEO. He was very much a celebrity CEO to some degree, and because of all the missteps that he made, they actually brought in an executive coach. they realized that his authentic leadership style was not an effective means for either himself or the organization. In another example, recently, we have the issue where Google ended up firing an employee for a memo that he had written that conveyed some of his own personal beliefs and opinions about the diversity programs within the organization. Now, regardless of whether you believe or agree with the positions within that memo, I don't think anyone would disagree with the fact that he thought he was being authentic. And he thought, obviously, he was in an environment where he could share those opinions and share those beliefs and not receive any negative repercussions. Even the initial response from the company was espousing this idea that we have to value open, honest, and disagreeing opinions. But at the end of the day, the backlash was so high that he ended up losing his job for having conveyed those beliefs and those opinions. So with these two examples, there is some sense or some example that there's costs. There's absolutely costs to being authentic in the workplace. So if that's the case, why do we all think, and why do we see so much popular press encouraging this notion of authenticity? And I suggest when I started thinking, when I was in the process of developing my own research agenda, this topic is what I decided to really dive into. And the first big issue that arose in my awareness because of how the academics around this topic have occurred is just even around the definition. We can't even agree as academics on the definition of what authenticity is. So in the context of when I talk about it, I'm attempting to use a very common definition that all of us would potentially agree to. It's just the very basic idea that being authentic is an alignment of what's going on inside a person, their internal experiences, and their external expression. Now, the issue arises because most academics that have done research on authenticity at this point don't agree with this definition. Brené Brown is a very acclaimed and successful academic that has done a lot of research. Her definition of authenticity requires a chapter of her dissertation. It's 30 pages long. Other scholars, there's constant debates going on in both academics and in the popular press about what authenticity is it good, is it bad? And typically at the end of the day, we end up in an argument about, well, what do you even mean when you're saying the word authentic? But we as a culture and as a society have a general understanding, right? We all have a sense of what authenticity is, and it's this basic one. And so my argument and our position when we're pushing this research ahead is that we have to use the definition that's already in the minds of most culture and society. Because if not, we're prescribing things on a topic that's going to be misused. And so when we read about authentic leadership and authenticity in general and everything that's being encouraged by it, it's potentially being used as a weapon for incivility, for rudeness, and of the like. So in our research, this is the basic definition that we are going to end up using. And there's two really important points of this definition, especially as leaders and as managers and organizations. One, we believe and understand that authenticity can fluctuate. We can vary between being authentic at one moment and not authentic in another, or authentic in some roles and not authentic in others. We can also be influenced by environmental factors. As managers, that's really important. That means we can influence the degree to which our employees feel safe to be authentic, and the context in which it's okay to be authentic, or the type of authenticity we're looking for in our employees. It's also important with this simple definition that there is such a thing as an authentic jerk. In a lot of definitions of authenticity, there's a moral assumption. There's this idea that not only are you authentic, but you're good. It's a virtue. And so that's where a lot of this misunderstanding comes from. So if we've removed that from the definition, now we have the ability to have individuals that are authentically abusive, unethical, willfully ignorant, and otherwise destructive. So this allows us to be more in line with just the cultural, current society's understanding of the topic. So if you think about the state of the literature as we are moving into it, the reason, because of how authenticity has previously been defined, it's really been focused on how it affects positive personal things, how it affects your self-esteem, your well-being, your levels of stress, and not surprisingly, it's good for all of those things, right? The more authentic you are, the happier you are, the more satisfied you are with life. And this comes out of clinical literature because the notion of authenticity originated in counseling psychology. It's the result of psychotherapy and work with a therapist and reaching this level of awareness and a fully functioning person. So that this isn't the Donald Trumps of authenticity, right? It's working through and being able to use what you understand and know internally about yourself in a very healthy, impactful way. When we've moved more recently into the work research, we find similar trends. In general, being authentic at work leads to positive things. It leads to higher levels of engagement, higher levels of performance, job satisfaction, retention, reduced stress, and exhaustion. And we know that primarily from research in another literature called emotional labor. Anyone that works in the service industry, right, where we know that you have to fake it sometimes. Smile, the customer's always right, service with a smile. And we know that the result or the outcomes of that type of work is higher levels of stress and exhaustion. So we can think about it in terms of the reverse, that if you could be more authentic, you would be less stressed. So given all that information, again, we're more or less seeing evidence that being authentic is good. So where are we going with this? Well, what do we know versus what do we still not know? We know that being authentic has a lot of personal positive outcomes or benefits. But we also know that the majority of the research that's been done is more related to authenticity being thought of as a virtue or a character strength or the like. We don't know the social implications of being authentic at work. And that's where the costs can really come into play. So we don't know how being authentic affects your work relationships with coworkers and affects the perception that your supervisor has of you. Similarly, we don't know if all authenticity is really created equal. Once we account for these more negative or dark traits in individuals, would we still see that same pattern of outcomes that we've seen in the research previously? And so that's what we're doing instead. We examine authenticity's impact on not just the personal outcomes, but also on the coworker relationship quality and on the perceptions of the career success based on the perceptions that your leader or supervisor has of you. And we also examine three distinct aspects of individuals that could prove to be potentially costly in that context of personal, relational, and career outcomes. So quickly, yes, we know that authenticity influences the personal outcome of employee engagement. And why is that the case? Well, when you go to work and you can bring your truthful self to work, you have more resources within yourself to commit to or apply to the execution of the task, the job you're doing. You're not monitoring yourself, you're not worrying about hiding something, you're not worried about being found out for something you don't want your coworkers to know, right? All of your guards are down and you're able to just focus on the work at hand. So in general, we do expect a positive relationship. In terms of relationships, the theory is a little bit more complex. So when you're authentic at work, you end up feeling as though your coworkers know you better, right? Because they're reflecting back to you your feelings, the way you understand yourself. You're getting the sense that they understand you. And that constant reflection back and forth creates a predictable, consistent foundation that you can develop a high-quality, trusting, intimate relationship. And as a result of that back and forth, that persistence and that continuity, we would expect that you're going to have a strong relationship with your coworkers in terms of positive interactions, and a negative relationship in terms of
negative interactions, right? So authenticity will lead to your coworkers wanting to help you more, and it'll reduce the amount of types of uncivil behaviors that you would receive as a result. We also think authenticity will influence a number of attributes of career success for similar reasons, right? So we know that authenticity, if it influences your engagement and your interactions with your coworkers, it's also going to influence the degree to which you can do your job. But not just that, it's also going to influence the value that your supervisor attaches to you. How much do they perceive you as being valuable to the organization? And from a future-oriented perspective, do they see you being able to move up and continue to add value to your organization over time? So this is what we see for the basic attributes. But in terms of if all authenticity is being created equal, we look at 3 dark side attributes. So the first one would be narcissism, or when individuals are overly positive about how they feel. The second attribute would be overly inappropriate negative self-view, so someone with extremely low self-esteem. And the third one being any type of attribute or trait where an individual would hold opinions or values that would be undesirable in an interdependent context. So for this study, we use social dominance orientation, someone that believes that there's a hierarchy within society, that some groups should be ranked higher than others. They lack empathy, they're very self-oriented. And so what do we think happens if we integrate those personality traits? Well, for engagement, it actually depends. We think for narcissism, it'll strengthen the relationship because their mask can come off and they're just going to be who they really are, right? For self-esteem, we actually think the relationship becomes less or weakens because it's a negative cycle where they kind of have some self-doubt, they talk themselves down, they feel as though they don't have what it takes, so they're reducing their own drive to be motivated at work. In terms of coworker interactions, we expect that these traits will weaken the relationship, so instead of having strong positive relationships with your coworkers, will end up becoming weaker or negative. And with instability, we expect the opposite to occur. And then finally, with effectiveness, we expect that a similar pattern where for these dark traits, the strong positive relationship will become even weaker or maybe even negative. And so in terms of our study context, we studied individuals within 2 different companies. And we used validated measures. For time 1, we did authenticity, narcissism, self-esteem, and social dominance orientation. At time 2, we measured engagement, coworker support, and instability. And in time 3, we had supervisors provide reports of past performance, perceived value to the organization, and promotability. And we used stepwise or hierarchical regression for all the analyses. So we found, again, that authenticity does lead to engagement, but we did find that there's a cost when it comes to people with low self-esteem. So what this graph shows us, you can see that the low self-esteem line is flatter, meaning that the relationship between authenticity and engagement becomes weaker for people with low self-esteem as compared to people with high self-esteem. We find a similar pattern with narcissism, in that it's an opposite pattern, in that people that are highly narcissistic, their relationship between authenticity and engagement becomes stronger, as expected. We found that authenticity relates to coworker instrumental support in the direction that was expected, but it didn't significantly relate to instability. We did find a similar cost between authenticity and coworker support when it came to self-esteem. People with low self-esteem, when they were being truly authentic, it ends up hurting the relationships and the support they have with their coworkers. We have a similar pattern, not with just instrumental coworker support, but also with coworker trust, coworker relationship quality. So we've repeatedly gathered data that supports this pattern of results.
And then probably most importantly, we didn't find a direct effect between authenticity and effectiveness. But we found a really interesting interaction with narcissism. And what this X, which is what academics love finding when they're looking for hypotheses with moderation, is that we see that when people are low on narcissism, the relationship between authenticity and effectiveness is positive. But highly narcissistic individuals, when they're authentic, we're seeing their relationship become negative. The more authentic, highly narcissistic individuals are, the less quality, or the less highly their supervisors think of them. So while narcissists are getting a benefit in terms of their engagement, they're actually costing themselves in terms of the perspective or the insight that their supervisor has of them. So this is truly an example of the cost that we're suggesting when it comes to being authentic at work. So in general, we did find that authenticity was related not just to the personal outcomes that have been widely studied in a lot of contexts, but there's impact that authenticity has on relationships and on career effectiveness. We found that self-esteem, something that we don't typically think of as a dark trait, impacts the relationship between authenticity and both engagement and coworker support in a way that provides some counterintuitive insights for how you should be developing and coaching people that you suspect to have self-esteem issues or self-view issues. Narcissism we found to be extremely interesting in the context of authenticity. It increases the relationship with engagement, but it decreases and it becomes negative in terms of the relationship with effectiveness. And we do need to do some more work because we didn't find the results we expected on social dominance, orientation, on coworker stability. And I suspect that these are just really difficult questions to get people to answer honestly on surveys. And that's something that we as researchers end up having a lot of challenges that we're beginning to address is what are other ways we can gather data on these more negative traits and the negative behaviors. So just in terms of practical implications, what are the takeaways of this study? Well, one, it's really thinking about the double-edged sword that org cultures that tout the benefits of authenticity could end up having on both the individuals within the company and the organization at large. Definitely that authenticity shouldn't be used as an excuse for rude, uncivil, or other damaging behaviors, right? And also shouldn't be used as a place to avoid developing new ways, new traits, new behaviors, new work practices. And then finally, we should continue to consider the counterintuitive insights that we gain, especially on this idea of self-esteem and the idea that an individual's self-esteem shouldn't necessarily be encouraged to be themselves, but you as a leader should be working with them to build up their confidence and change their self-view as a result. And much more work needs to be done on the personality traits. We just chose 3, and there's many others that could be used to examine further the potential costs of authenticity in the workplace. So I'll leave you with this. As instead of being authentic, and also in honor of my 2 colleagues that have been talking about their dogs, this is a good takeaway. Don't be authentic, but instead be the person that your dog thinks you are.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
That's great. That's great. That's great. I love that last slide. We would all be better people if we would be the person that our dog thinks we are. How many of you are narcissists, by a show of hands? The interesting thing is actually, so the idea about methods comes up here when you ask people to self-report on some of these things. The interesting thing with narcissism is that actually a lot of true narcissists are happy to report that they're narcissists. So you have this really interesting finding that some things, it's a little bit risky when you ask people about their perception, because are they really good at evaluating themselves? Narcissism is not one that we have problems with, interestingly, in that. But it's interesting, too, to think about alternative methods. So where this I think gets neat is there are all kinds of biosensors like people wear. like heart rate monitors, and it'll look at your skin galvanic response to see how much you're sweating. And then they follow people and they track them in a room, and they want to see, well, when they're interacting with this person, this is what happens in here. So, you can understand how you can take a different perspective. We're really understanding things about leadership that we couldn't before with the introduction of some of these methods and looking at archives now with data everywhere, right? There's email chains, and you don't necessarily have to look at the content, but you might look at the tone, right? So there's programs that code for affect and tone that are not even doing. So if any of you remember Andy Fastow, the former chief financial officer of Enron, not one of the most loved people. I saw him fairly recently. He's doing a few things. He's giving talks to young finance people about how he ended up where he did. And he's also working, he's a principal, he's a partner at a company that's actually looking and tracking emails within companies, and not the content, but looking at tone and looking how just before really bad things happen, you can see it show up in the aggregate level when you look at email tone. It's kind of crazy, right? It's so people say, oh, is this ethical? Is it? Well, I mean, it's already being used actually by a number of companies are buying into this. But all of these new opportunities come out when we have access to a lot of these new methods, and we're understanding a lot of new things. And I think that's a great segue then to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Dorothy Carter, who is really embedded in, and I think really spends a lot of her time thinking about how we can understand new stuff by using different kinds of methods. And so some of what she's going to be talking about today is related to networks and leadership. Now, we saved the highest cognitive load talk for last. In other words, are you all ready to work a little bit? Because we're going to ask you to dig in a little bit here, because this is a little bit of a mind meld. Like this is a little bit of a brain twister, and there's going to be a few things, and she'll set it up. But there's a few things that I just want to put in your ear here, right? So we often talk about how leaders lead teams. Well, what does leadership in complex environments now, when we're talking about the way innovations are done, or the way big things get built, or the way teams are not only have a leader, but teams then have to interact and work with other teams. And leadership then looks very different, and it doesn't always come from the top. And there are people within, right, who are engaged in leadership. So if we stop thinking of the leader as the focus of leadership, that leadership also occurs from people claiming and granting and saying, oh, yes, I'm willing to accept the influence of that person. That can happen not just at the leader level, but it happens across teams. So are you ready? So Dorothy Carter is an assistant professor of industrial and organizational psychology at the University of Georgia and the director of the Leadership Innovation Networks and Collaboration Laboratory at UGA. Her research investigates the drivers of effective leadership and teamwork in complex organizational settings, such as healthcare, scientific collaboration, the military, and yes, even space exploration. Her research has been published in multiple top-tier journals in psychology and management, and she is currently the primary investigator on a grant from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So you heard that long intro for West Point. You probably picked that up. This is NASA. So she is involved with some research related to the Mars mission. When we finally take off to Mars, you can say, yeah, I heard her talk that time. Dr. Carter is also the recipient of the 2017 Alva H. Chapman Jr. Outstanding Dissertation Award, which is given by the Center for Leadership. And we'll have a very brief presentation after her talk. But Dr. Carter, welcome.
So thank you so much, Nathan, for that wonderful introduction and for hosting me here at FIU. It's been wonderful. And also for coordinating this fantastic award with Modesto. I saw him earlier. it's really special for me to have won this award. It was definitely something that I heard about early on at the Academy of Management conference when I was like a first or second year, and it really inspired me to kind of go in the direction of leadership that I was thinking about. So you and Vanessa are my transformational leadership people or my transformational leaders for doing leadership research. And I appreciate it. So I'm going to move around. My name is Dorothy Carter, as Caitlin mentioned. My talk today is called The Team Priorities That Lead and Follow, Facilitating Inter-Team Leadership in Cross-Functional Multi-Team Systems. So already I'm making you work by this title, but I'll try to tone down the work right after this. This is a paper that is under review now based on both my master's thesis and dissertation. Colleagues up there, Leslie DeChurch, Cynthia Noppin, Steve Zaccaro, and Ashir Contractor are also on this paper. Leslie, Steve, and Ashir are all committee members on my thesis and dissertation, and then Cindy is a graduate student I work with at University of Georgia. So what got me into this space is the desire to understand about teamwork in organizations. What we know, based on research on teams, and probably everybody's experience in here, is that very often organizations rely on teams to solve problems. And in particular, a lot of times organizations will bring people together that have different areas of expertise. We call these cross-functional teams. And so organizations are very often relying on cross-functional teams composed of people from different backgrounds to solve problems and to innovate and to bring their various backgrounds and ideas to bear and combine them toward problems. But a lot of the problems facing organizations today and society at large are requiring the skills and the deep disciplinary expertise that's kind of beyond the scope of a single team. And instead, what we're having to do a lot nowadays is bring multiple teams together, that each one of those teams is specialized in a unique way and can collaborate with we hope, they'll collaborate with other teams to solve big, complex problems. We think of these in the academic literature they're called multi-team systems. So it's just a system of people composed of at least two teams that are doing their own things separately. They're following their own goals and their local priorities, but they're also combining with other teams to solve bigger problems, which we call superordinate goals. So a superordinate goal is something that requires the interdependent interactions between multiple subgroups or teams. So multi-team systems in general are defined as what you see up here, two or more distinct teams that are linked together by virtue of their interdependence towards these common superordinate goals. And cross-functional multi-team systems, those emphasize component team specialization. So these are teams that are specialized in terms of their areas of expertise or their backgrounds. And by joining together specialized component teams, we can capitalize on these deep disciplinary areas of expertise and solve big multifaceted problems by breaking them down. For example, if we're going to try to build a new high school in a local town, we might need to bring teams like a building committee, the school board, the town council, or architectural team together. And each one of them knows specific things, but we know that together, maybe they can solve this big problem. In 2010, when 33 miners were trapped underground in Chile, different teams from the military, United States and Chile, military, NASA, other public and private sector agencies were all brought together to solve this problem, and they did so successfully. Another success happened after a major failure, which the failure was the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. But a successful collaboration happened right after that, which was to respond to the disaster and clean up the debris and understand what happened. And in order to respond to that disaster, that took specialized teams from multiple different organizations, again, with different areas of expertise. And it was kind of this ad hoc situation. It wasn't totally planned. They weren't expecting this disaster to happen. But relative strangers from dissimilar agencies without a designated leader, so there's not just one boss in this situation. They all were able to quickly collaborate across these organizational boundaries on this unprecedented, complex undertaking that required this specialized expertise from multiple different areas. And so this is kind of the area that I'm most fascinated by. It's what makes this tick, right? What makes it work, we need these teams to work together. And we know that what we would like them to do in our hopes and dreams is that they would be able to combine and synthesize their expertise from these different domains in new ways and generate innovative solutions to these complex problems. And innovative solutions just means something that's created, like hasn't been really thought before, but it's also useful. It's going to be able to be put to practice and solve that problem. For example, we're going to be able to address the debris that's spread out across Texas and Florida. And in order to, we know from research on small teams that are composed of people from different backgrounds, in order for those small cross-functional teams to actually solve the problems that we put them together for, we know that it's going to take people from the different areas of expertise to try to influence one another. We want people from different backgrounds and thought processes to contribute their ideas. Because if they just stay silent, then their ideas never get used, never get incorporated into the decision. So this is like an example of this. We've got 3 different people right here with the colors representing areas of expertise. So the green, blue, and yellow people are trying to all attempting to influence the group. And so they might be taking responsibility for the group discussion. They also might be trying to contribute unique ideas. But the kind of flip side of that is we can't just have everybody only contributing ideas and never listening and never trying to accept the influence of the people who are contributing ideas. So not only does it take people contributing and trying to influence the group, but it also takes that people will accept the influence of one another. And that's kind of depicted up here. We've got 3 different people, and the arrows represent their willingness and their acceptance of the influence of one another, right? So this is willingness to grant influence to those from different backgrounds, as required by testimony. We know from research on small cross-functional teams that that's what really helps in terms of, do I recognize that, oh, you're a physicist, and this is a problem that requires some physicist expertise. Now I'm going to be willing to accept your influence. And so these processes of influence, trying to attempt to influence the group and also accepting the influence of others, leadership researchers in recent years have argued that actually that those are key essential elements of this phenomenon of leadership. So a lot of times leadership has been talked about from the perspective of like a single formal leader. What does that leader do? What traits does that person have? And that is very important. But researchers in recent years have realized that, it's, as you guys have both put it today, it's not just about the actions and the behaviors of that formal leader, it's also how that person is being received in relationships. And so what you see up here is kind of the way that leadership researchers are increasingly thinking about the phenomenon of leadership. It's a social relationship that can emerge between people. Those people may be the boss and their subordinate, but they don't always have to be. You can be influenced. You can accept the leadership influence of people who are not necessarily your supervisor in the formal hierarchy. And so what you see here is person A is a follower at this instance. Maybe they are actually the formal boss, but they're accepting the influence of someone else. Person B is the leader. And that relationship emerges through these formal and or informal influence processes in social settings. And this way of thinking about leadership as this relationship that can emerge and evolve between people is actually super beneficial in terms of thinking about what does leadership look like in multi-team systems. So I told you that I'm really interested in what makes these systems tick, right? What makes cross-functional multi-team systems effective? Well, coming from a leadership perspective, leadership is a very critical component of what makes groups effective because literally nothing gets accomplished without it. So these systems, we know, based on our theory and research, that leadership somehow is going to be important. But we also know that in cross-functional multi-team systems, they can't always rely on a formal leadership structure. There isn't always a boss, as we saw in this example from the disaster response, that relative strangers from dissimilar agencies quickly collaborated. They were able to influence one another and accept one another's ideas on the spur of the moment as an ad hoc system. So in fact, this way of thinking about leadership as a formal and/or informal relationship that can emerge and evolve between people allows us to think about what does leadership look like in these cross-functional multi-team systems. So, the study one of this paper is thinking about, okay, if we think about cross-functional multi-team systems are important, and they solve complex, important problems. We also know that leadership is an important phenomenon in groups, meaning cross-functional teams, but also cross-functional multi-team systems. And, okay, so we know that leadership is important, we know that cross-functional multi-team systems tackle important problems. What I wanted to know in study one was, okay, well, what does it take? What does leadership look like in multi-team systems? And building on this idea that in a cross-functional team, that you need people from different backgrounds to influence one another, we thought, well, maybe that also happens in bigger systems too. We probably need people from different backgrounds to influence one another. The difference between a cross-functional team and a cross-functional multi-team system, though, is that in a team, expertise is within different individuals. In a cross-functional multi-team system, it's just a little bit bigger. There's expertise that's different, that's found in different teams. So we thought, okay, just like we find in a cross-functional team, probably we need influence like claims and grants to emerge between the different teams that are specialized in different ways. Well, that's all well and good. We tell, oh, purple people, you guys should influence blue people, and vice versa, right? But if anybody has ever been a human on Earth, we also know that that doesn't always happen effectively, right? Very often, when people are in different groups, we don't tend to naturally want to accept the influence of people from other groups. And in fact, in cross-functional multi-team systems where people from different organizations and areas of expertise and backgrounds and geographic locations, it's even like maybe less likely than if everybody is kind of the same kind of person, right? So, study one hypothesis here is that, number one, we need it. We need people to cross their boundaries and claim and grant influence between different areas of expertise. But number two, we also know that that's unlikely to happen. So in study one, what we did is we took 432 students who were in 3 different classes in university settings. So there was 2 classes in America, 1 class in France. One of the classes was a psychology class, another was an environmental science class, and another one was a business innovation management class. So imagine that you guys are college students and you're told on day one, okay, you're gonna work in a team, but not just with each other, you're also gonna work across the world with this other team in France and another team in the environmental science program. And we told these cross-functional multi-team systems, composed of students from different classes, that by the end of the semester, you guys have to come up with an innovative solution to a complex environmental science problem. And you're gonna need to use all of the expertise that's found all over this place, so there's psychology, environmental science, and business, and come up with a plan for us. And then what we did is we surveyed them in a bunch of different ways. But one of the things that we did was we surveyed them about who did they accept leadership from. So there wasn't actually a boss in these systems. They were just formed at the beginning of the class. And we wanted to map what are the patterns of leadership relationships looking like. And then we compared, okay, across these 47 multi-team systems composed of 3 different teams each, were there differences in terms of the way that their leadership relationships looked like? And did those differences have any effect on whether the systems were able to do this task of develop an innovative solution? And we rated that using external panels of subject matter experts. So one of the things we find, I'm not going to get into these crazy analyses, is that number one, our hypothesis was supported, which you guys would all have guessed, right? Leadership relationships between teams, between different areas of expertise, are just statistically unlikely. We don't naturally affiliate with people who are different from ourselves, right? Number two, though, we also found that when cross-functional multi-team systems did do it more than what was natural, those systems developed the most innovative, creative, and useful ideas, as rated by subject matter experts. Okay, so this study one essentially demonstrates that there is a disconnect between what we naturally tend to do as humans and what might be effective as a cross-functional multi-team system. And it suggests that as managers of a team, for example, you might need to intervene to facilitate the emergence of these inter-team leadership relationships in these cross-functional systems. So then study 2, that was kind of our inspiration. It's like, well, if you were a manager of a team, what would you do to make sure that say that you're a manager of a team and you don't have control over the whole system, right? But you know that you want your team to work effectively with the 3 other teams that it's coming in contact with. And you want your team members to be able to affect change. You want your team members to be able to be influential throughout the bigger system. And you also want them to be willing to accept the influence of other people. So that was the inspiration for study 2. And so approaching that problem, it's a great idea to just kind of go back to the research, go back to the theory. And there is this theory called the social interdependence theory. And social interdependence theory suggests that when people are focused on particular goals, then they engage in behaviors that support those goals. Okay, so when people are focused on particular goals, then they'll engage in behaviors that support those goals. So I thought, if you're a manager of a team, and you want your members of your team to be influential throughout the system, and you also want them to play nicely with others and accept the influence from people of other expertise, social interdependence theory would suggest that you can create that situation by focusing your team's attention on the bigger picture. So talking to them about the shared subordinate goal and making sure that they understand it and making sure that they're reinforced for it, so they're paid for it, right? They're valuing the bigger picture somehow. And social interdependence theory would suggest that if you do that, then they're more likely to be influential throughout the bigger system. Because, you know what, if you make sure that your follower, like your immediate followers, care about the bigger picture, then they're going to talk to other people about that bigger picture. That becomes more inspiring and transformational for other people, and it also conveys this sense of an understanding of a shared subordinate identity. And all that being said, other people are just more likely to accept the influence of people who are conveying this shared subordinate identity and a focus on the bigger picture. So number 1, when you focus your team on the subordinate goal, your team members are likely to be more influential in relation to other teams. Number 2, social interdependence theory suggests that when you see other people as fellow collaborators, which you would do if you're focused on the bigger picture, then you're more willing to accept their influence. You're more willing to be influenced. So that suggests our study 2 hypotheses that focusing people on the bigger picture, on that subordinate goal, is going to lead them to talk about that bigger picture and also lead them to be seen by others as leaders. But also, they're likely to think about other people as fellow collaborators and therefore are more willing to accept the influence of others. So in order to study this, we did a controlled laboratory experiment with 264 participants who were assembled into 22 cross-functional multi-team systems. What we did is we told them, okay, here's your task. In the next 4 hours, you're going to have to work with these other people from different areas of expertise to build a well in this fictitious region of the world. We've got 3 of you guys who are geology team members who know about depths of water, 3 of you guys who are engineering team members who understand how to design a well, 3 of you guys who are construction team members who know how to build a well, and 3 of you guys who are village council leaders who know about the local political constraints of that region. And so what we did is we told them, okay, here's your bigger picture, here's your subordinate goal, build that well that gets a lot of water to a lot of people. But we manipulated what each team cared about. So basically what we were doing is we were manipulating, so we were pretending that each one of those teams had a different manager. And that different manager was telling them, here's what you care about. Forget what those other teams care about, this is what we care about here. For example, the geology team, they were told to care about the bigger picture. The village council team was told to care about the bigger picture, but also kind of not. The engineering team was told, don't worry about the bigger picture, you're just here to design a well. It can cost as much as you want, for example. And then finally, the construction team was told to care about reducing their own costs. They were actually told to care about a goal that to some degree conflicted with the bigger picture, right? And they communicated between teams using this inter-team communication system that we built in the program. And again, we asked people, who did you rely on for leadership? assuming that leadership was something that could emerge between people and was not necessarily something that we were controlling. We calculated the degree to which people reference the subordinate goal by doing some kind of lexical big data analysis through this inter-team communication system. Then we also surveyed people's perceptions of what we call their inter-team goal interference. So that just means like whether they see the other teams as collaborators. And then finally, we also calculated multi-team system performance, which was automatically generated by the task, which is basically like, did this system get a lot of water to a lot of people? Okay, so I'll quickly go through the findings. We did find support for our hypotheses. Basically, if you were on a team, you as an individual, if you were on a team that told you that you were supposed to care about the bigger picture, you did talk about that bigger picture more often. And then you also were seen as a leader by other people more often. On the other hand, you were also more likely to see other teams as collaborators, and therefore you were more willing to follow and accept the influence of other people. We did some also supplemental analyses that said, okay, by virtue of the way that we designed this study, we had different teams that caring about different things, and we also allowed people to choose who they would accept influence from. It was kind of like a free-for-all, like what's going to happen in this situation. And we found what we expected in terms of who's going to lead and who's going to follow. But we also did find some variability across the different systems in terms of how much different teams were influential. And in particular, we thought, okay, well, in some of these systems, the geology team, which did care about the bigger picture, ended up becoming more influential. In other systems, the construction team, which, again, there's variability. In some of these systems, the construction team, which wanted to take the system down, right? Like all they cared about was their team. Sometimes those people did become influential. And lo and behold, we find that when those teams that cared about the bigger picture were relied on for leadership, the system did better. More water was provided to more people. And on the other hand, when the team that didn't care about the bigger picture was influential, that's when the system did the worst. So in terms of conclusion from the study, we find that inter-team leadership is often needed, but it's unlikely. But you can, as a manager, increase the likelihood that your followers are going to engage in these leadership relationships by focusing their attention on the shared subordinate goal. So this is like a suggestion that, okay, even when you don't have control over everything in the system, you can affect change. Caveat, however, is that sometimes reinforcing subordinate goals is not always feasible, right? Like you can't always pay people for doing the bigger picture when you have like local constraints. And the other thing is that just focusing your team on that shared subordinate goal might be a little bit problematic at times when you're dealing with teams that are competitive, right? So we find that when you care about the bigger picture, you're just very open and willing to follow members of other teams. That is not always a good thing when you realize that those other teams don't have the system's best interests at heart. So that's the end of that. Our next step is helping to send the team to Mars. Basically, what this project is about is building on this idea that there's some patterns of relationships that are natural, like group outcome differences are natural, but sometimes we need to help people overcome those. So in terms of sending a team to Mars, we want to understand what kind of patterns of relationships are likely to happen in the context of NASA, and then when and how should we intervene to change those relationships.
Thank you. Is your mind bending a little bit? But I think you see here, there's a theme, there's a number of things that come up again and again here. And I think one of them that's related to this idea that leadership can take on different forms. It doesn't always look the same. It's context specific. Is we start with the assumption in Dorothy's that the leader can't know it all. There is not one leader, and there might be multiple leaders. You can't solve complex problems. You can't send a mission to Mars, right? And the only way you can do, and if you think of department or initiatives you might have going on in your work, where you have to work across functions, across different departments. Where do the breakdowns occur? This research is really at the forefront in helping us understand, yeah, we're studying teams, that's important, but now we're actually studying how teams interact with other teams to get really big things done and all of the things that can go wrong. For those of you who have worked in multi-team systems, which is, when you start looking, they're around everywhere, all kinds of things can go wrong. And I think what's neat is this idea of how do we look at formal leadership in multi-team systems, and what can the leader do to create the right environment, or leaders do the right thing to create the right environment for leadership between different members of the collective to level up and have an influence, right? So they can coexist at the same time. You can have formal leadership and you can have leadership bubbling up. It should, in fact, happen. And you want the team to be a team, but you don't want them to be too much of a team that they won't interact with other teams, right? And so my brain hurts in a good way because I think this is really innovative. And I want to thank all of you, each three of you, for your time today. We have time for a few questions. And if any of you want to ask after, they will be, we'll have some time offline. They'll be back. We'll have a brief reception. But we just maybe have time for one or two quick questions here before we get to the end of our time here together. You can shout it out. You don't have to stand up at the microphone. We won't put you on the spot unless it's authentically you. Any questions for any of our presenters?
Sorry, that's a great segue, by the way. My question is for Ms. Brooke. In regards to authenticity and the calling for it in the workplace as a leader, do you believe that it's a direct correlation with the imposter syndrome that many leaders, managers are suffering nowadays, particularly women?
Mm-hmm. The question on gender, let me answer that first, is really interesting and something that needs a lot more research. I didn't have a chance to show it, but one of my slides actually demonstrated that the role of authenticity in influencing those career outcomes was only significant for women and not men. And that's really an interesting implication. It's a very exploratory piece of data that I don't know exactly what that means, but the initial take is that being authentic is something that's more important for women to be perceived as authentic as opposed to men. Other things appear to be influencing their leaders' evaluations of their effectiveness. And in terms of imposter syndrome, I think it's a little broader, and now I'm just speculating. I don't have the research to show, but the craving of our society to be authentic, and some point to even the Oprah movement, kind of that self-help, wanting to just kind of explore ourselves and be vulnerable and move away from that need to be perfect. So to that degree, I think that's absolutely part of why it's become such a popular trend. I mean, if anyone's on Facebook and knows someone that sells Rodan and Fields, right? We know that we see these types of messages and things kind of inundating us on a daily basis of pushing us to be authentic in one way, shape, or form. So there's something that's missing that we're striving for, but I think there's a cautionary tale there that sometimes that striving is being used for damaging purposes or as an excuse or a crutch to be uncivil or incivil. And I think Dr. Porras' talk just from a few weeks ago really spoke to that trend that we're seeing of increasing incivility in the workplace aligns fairly well with the increase in the popularity of authenticity. And so that's something that probably needs to be researched to some degree if there's a cause in that. Thank you.
We have time for one more. Great question. Okay, can you yell it? Yeah.
I wonder if you have multiple teams, whether the distance at which those teams sit makes a difference. So you can have multiple teams all within the same building, maybe the same floor, or you can have multiple teams that are across different sites or different countries even. I wonder whether things like how things
an idea in the literature on team systems that in a system, teams can be more or less differentiated, and there can be different dimensions along which they can be differentiated, right? So one of them is geographic separation. Another one is, areas of expertise, whether they have different norms or processes and that sort of thing. And that is kind of the basis for the hypothesis 2 in our first study, is that when in cross-functional systems, it's really unlikely that they're going to develop these influence relationships, whereas it might be a little bit more likely in situations where people are kind of in the same organization, they have similar norms, they understand each other a little bit better. And I think that these kind of priorities that are emphasized in different teams can either help people overcome those differences or exacerbate those differences, right? So even if you are on the other side of the world with another team, but you realize that you guys care about the similar things, then you're maybe more likely to do the extra effort and wake up at 4 in the morning and have a call with them or something. Yeah. But I think the virtuality component could be especially helpful in terms of coming from like IS perspective or whatever, that helping people understand what they care about and that sort of thing.
Thank you. And so they'll be available to answer all of life's questions, including the meaning of life and whatever else. How to pick lottery numbers, I think, too, and after. No, but really, I want to give you a round of applause and thank you for all for being here. This reminds me again that good leadership does not happen by chance. It doesn't happen unless we're mindful. And sometimes if we make small adjustments, it can have a huge impact in the outcomes. And that's exciting to me as someone who thinks about leadership and leadership development, because sometimes we just need to make one little tweak in how we design a system. We just need to make one little tweak in being mindful of how authentic we're being, and maybe we should check it here right now. We just need to be a little bit mindful about this idea of, are we falling into the trap of thinking there's only one way to be effective as a leader? And I appreciate that encouragement. So as we close here, I want to just mention that each year, as I alluded to before, the Alva Chapman Jr. Outstanding Dissertation Award is presented to honor an individual whose dissertation makes an outstanding contribution in the field of leadership. This year we had 20 submissions from all over the world. This is not an FIU. This is an FIU works with the Academy of Management Network of Leadership Scholars to present this award, but this award is open to anyone in the world. And we've had people apply from, I think, four continents for this award. This year's winner is our third presenter, is Dr. Dorothy Carter, and we're thrilled, and we'd like to call her up and present her with an award.